We're live. This week we have a really awesome training for Bitovi's front-end training. We're here with Kevin Phillips and Matthew Phillips. They are of no relation, although you would not think by that.
I don't know that for sure.
Facial hair.
At some point, we probably are related. You go back far enough. Probably.
Yeah. I've actually read that we're all surprisingly right.
It's
like,
true.
you don't have to go back many ancestors till there's you're pretty much your spouse's cousin. That's why my spouse is Indian. There's a little bit more time, hopefully, before her mom and her great grandma is my great granddad. But yeah, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. What we are talking about today is Kevin added a really awesome new feature to StealJS that allows it to do dependency injection. If you are from Angular's world, you are a big fan of dependency injection. It can help make testing a lot easier. That's probably one of the biggest things it can do. It can also kind of help decouple modules and make it so you can kind of swap other code in and make something work. But while Angular, it's nice that it can do that and it has hooks almost everywhere for dependency injection. The dependency injection that Kevin's going to be showing is actually built into Steel and is done through module loading. So you can actually dependency inject a module, a dependency of another module. Which, I don't know, to me is the right way of doing it. You get those dependency injection points for free. So I'm really excited to see what Kevin shows us. So, Kevin, you want to?
Cool, yeah. You kind of stole the thunder from the end of my...
do it again, then.
But that's cool, no problem. Yeah, so I will talk about Angular a little bit at the end and how they do dependency injection and how it's different from what we're doing with Steel. But yeah. But first, kind of explain what dependency injection is. I think it's easier to understand just by looking at what the problem is that it's solving, instead of trying to figure out conceptually what it means. So that's what I will do. So the problem is basically that sometimes it can be difficult to test a module without first understanding how its dependencies work. We can take a look at a small example that shows this. So this is my example code that I have been using to explain this. We basically have this greeting function that we want to test, and it is importing this name function from a separate module. And so if you want to test the greeting function, test the logic of this greeting function, it's pretty simple. All it does is if you have a name, it will return back welcome back name. If you don't, it just says welcome. This is some code that I've actually written on the site, so it's not totally made up. But the problem is, to test that, you kind of have to know what the name function does. You need the name function to return back something specific in order for you to test this logic. So, yeah. So basically, you have to ask a bunch of questions. Is name making an HTTP request? And if it is, what request is it making? Is it using a library or framework? And what does the response look like for that, from the server? So if we assume it is making an HTTP request, one way to test this is by mocking out the response that the server returns and using that to kind of test all of this logic. So in CAN.js we have can fixture, and it's really great for testing this kind of thing, or for testing models, but it makes it a lot more complicated to actually test the greeting function, which is like a couple layers up from the actual server response. And the other piece of that is what you end up testing is a lot more than just the greeting function. You end up testing the greeting function and the name or the user module, and all of the model layer that's in between the name function and the server. So that's kind of the first problem, is that you're no longer testing just one unit. Another problem is maintenance. So if sometime down the road this response from the server changes, then your name function is going to have to change to handle that response differently. But your test for the greeting function shouldn't be affected, but in this case they are, because you're going to have to update your fake response just to get your greeting function to work correctly, even though none of the greeting code actually changed. Another problem, or say later you start caching this data in local storage. Now you have to worry about mocking out local storage and mocking out the server, and then anytime either of those things change, you end up having to change how this greeting test is working, when really you shouldn't have to do that because the code is the same. So, kind of, how can we test greeting without understanding name? And the obvious answer is dependency injection, because that's what I'm talking about.
So we're going to change the value of name, right? We're gonna change what name does.
Yeah. So I can get back to this, but basically, testing with dependency injection, instead of worrying about what's happening downstream from name, all you're going to do is inject a mock module that does exactly what you want. So we can kind of go back to my simple definition here. So this is a little bit different from Angular and other traditional dependency injection, but the definition that I'm going to use is replacing the code that gets loaded when a JavaScript module is imported. So basically, when you import name, what code are you going to get back? Cool. So we'll get to some code of how this kind of works. This is setting up a test with StealClone using dependency injection. So there's kind of two pieces to this. The first one is the injecting. So we'll use StealClone here to inject this version of the user module. And in this, we're just going to return a promise that resolves with some local variable. So in our test, we can manipulate what this name value is, and it will always return back that local value. The second part is the input. So once you done the injecting, the next thing you want to do is import the module that you want to test, which will then get the code that you've injected.
Hey, Kevin, sorry to interrupt you real quick.
No problem.
I think it might be useful to why is it clone? That's the first thing that they need to do is call clone. Why is it called clone?
Yeah. So in this case, it's called StealClone because what you're actually doing is you're creating a clone of the loader that Steal is using underneath the hood, and you're cloning that loader and then passing it this list of modules that you want to override any modules that existed in the original loader. For this dependency injection case, I think sometimes it's easier to actually call this injector or inject, and then injector and do this to make it a little more obvious what you're doing. But since it's still clone, we'll call it clone. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Cool.
All right. So the second part is once you've cloned the loader, then you import your module that you want to test from the loader, and when it looks up its dependencies, it's going to get any of those modules that you've overridden. So it will get your, this passed-in copy of the user module. Cool. So looking at this all together, we basically import StealClone, we clone the loader, passing in any modules we want to overwrite, and then do an import, and then store our copy so that we can use that for our tests. So that's setting up the tests. The part where you really get the wins from this is in your actual test cases, because it's really easy to manipulate that data that's being passed in. So really, we can just update this local variable we're using to test, and then we can see that our value is correct based on that. We can run another test where we set that value and see we're getting back the correct thing.
So, Kevin, if this is benefiting from the fact that the name can be defined after the injection has taken place.
Right.
And that might not always be the case.
Yeah, that's true. That might not be the case. This is definitely benefiting from that because the name is called the greeting function. Yeah, Yeah, so this is benefiting because we call name here. If we, called name outside and cached it or something like that, then it would be a little bit different. And in that case, what you might have to do is clone your loader and do the import in your test cases so that each of your test cases can provide different data.
You could always wrap, because this is all promise-based, you could wrap, like you could make a helper function that would say, get me navigation so that name is going to be this, and then you call it that helper function, which would do the cloning, but inject what name should be at that time. And you could.
Yeah, you could. So kind of what you're talking about is something like clone and set name or something.
Yeah. I think
and that would do this stuff.
Yeah, and then it would return when it was done, and it would return you that navigation that has been set up.
Yeah, you could do that.
Yeah, I think one thing just with testing, I think people for some reason are afraid to add a lot of helper functions in their tests. Like they're afraid to. A lot of times, I'll find myself creating utilities to help test things. Mm-hmm. So I can run through a bunch of different options really quickly, or do maybe something like this, or hey, I want to test a menu system, so I'm going to write some standard functionality that will open up the menu and then it's going to select the item and let me know when everything is finished. I just think in general, don't be afraid to add make your own test modules that have helpers that your test can actually use.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree with that. I think creating functions that help you write tests is a good idea. The one thing that I don't like to do is have different tests sharing data. So I wouldn't want to create my test data up here and use that, manipulate it and use it throughout, because that ends up you don't realize that you're not cleaning up after yourself, and you get tests that are screwing up other tests and stuff like that. But yeah, I think creating functions to help you write tests is a great idea. Cool. So yeah, this is kind of a summary, a GIF showing a summary of this. So without dependency injection, what you end up testing is really a lot more than what you wanted to test. And with dependency injection, you're really just testing exactly the module that you're trying to test. Cool. So yeah, I want to take a quick second to talk about how this is different from other dependency injection implementations. So dependency injection has been around for a long time. It's used a lot in object-oriented. It's used a lot in Java, and it was brought to JavaScript kind of by Angular. I don't know if other people did it first, but Angular was really the big place where I've seen dependency injection being used in JavaScript. And in their implementation and other object-oriented implementations, you end up having to use the dependency injector all over the place. You have to use their frameworks everywhere so that the dependency injection container can understand your code and basically work as plumbing throughout your code.
So this is like you're setting up this is actually setting up some type of class, right?
So yeah, this would be kind of what my module would look like using Angular-like dependency injection. Say Angular-like because I didn't actually run and test this code to see if it works, but I think this is basically what it looks like.
Yeah,
so you have to, instead of being able to use your own modules, you basically have to buy into their module system, which handles some dependencies of other modules, and then you have to use their APIs to set up basically your class or your controller or whatever, so that the dependency injection will work. And then you can annotate it with this $inject, or there's 50 other ways to do it, to say that the navigation function requires this user function. So then Angular, what it's going to do behind the scenes is it's going to create you an instance of your user module, and it's going to pass that into this function when it gets called. So in order for it to do that, you have to basically use its APIs everywhere, and it can be difficult to integrate that with other module solutions. So if you're using ESX modules or CommonJS modules, gets kind of confusing to figure out when should I use those modules and when should I use Angular's modules and how are the two going to work together. So I think with our solution, it's really nice because you can just use the module system that you've already got, and you don't have to worry about modifying your code at all.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. Is you can kind of contain the injection part just to the test where you really need that injection.
Yeah, exactly. I think dependency injection does some other things for Angular aside from just making tests easier, but I don't know that in a lot of use cases you're going to realize. So it does a lot of handling of dependencies and making sure the correct things are created in the correct order and stuff like that. Solves other problems, but they're not. I don't know if they're as useful as the testing solution. So.
Yeah. So one thing I've not understood when I've always looked at Angular, like, oh, it's got dependency injection. Isn't that amazing? I've always looked at code like this and thought, well, you're creating your navigation object as a function that already takes a user. So why can't I, in my test, simply call the navigation function with a user that I've created?
Yeah, you should be able to, but the only problem is that there's no way to get the navigation function without going through Angular's module system to get it for you.
But I guess to me, that's why I've always looked at this code and been like, well, there's already a function. I'm already going through the effort of creating a function that obviously takes something that I want to inject, right?
Yeah.
Why can't I just, it seems like it's like you're already doing so much work to support dependency injection. Your code is already, I shouldn't say dependency injection. I should just call this like normal argument passing.
Yeah.
That the dependency injection part seems to me always like, well, that's kind of.
Well, isn't the reason is that like just in your normal code you're not going to pass in a user, like forget about the test, just the app itself, you're not going to pass in a user. The dependency injection is going to pass that in for you.
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't know why that's better, I guess, but I don't fully get it either.
To answer your question, there's no reason that you couldn't do that. I think this could be its own CommonJS module or whatever, and you could have that completely separate and testable, and then just import it here and pass it directly to so only have your Angular code in one place and have your actual functions that just take regular instance variables.
Yeah, I think
you could totally do that.
I think the place where it actually is useful, or where I've seen this useful, is I think it's a holdover, or maybe it is useful at a certain scale of application that needs a certain level of configuration. I forgot, Mark was telling me about this, someone at Bitovi, because I've been kind of out of the back end, but there's this thing where you pretty much have all your configuration, everything that can possibly be configured, you want it kind of coming from like one file, and then depending on your environment, different environments have a different version of this file, and there's some name for this way of building things. There's like 10 steps that Heroku is like, hey, here's the best things that work in Heroku, and this is like step number 4. Forgot what it's called. Maybe I can do an addendum after this. But one of those things, like to me, this is what this might be valuable for, is that kind of configuration where I can say, here's every configurable entry point for my entire application. So if I want user to be this, well, it's more straightforward, where you can declaratively in kind of some JSON object say, hey, user is this. Versus I'm going to create a user instance, then I'm going to pass that to my navigation constructor, and then I'm going to pass my navigation constructor to something else. Instead, it's like more of a flat configuration, and the system goes and wires it all up for you. I can see how that has advantages, but I find that probably not super useful in a lot of UI programming, because the level of configuration isn't that high in UI programming, at least.
Yeah, I think one place where this could be useful is figuring out the order of how to create your instances. I mean, I haven't seen it a lot in applications I've written, but I've seen people that have run into problems with instances being created in the correct order, and let's say you needed this user in 4 different places and it gets passed from one thing to another. I think that Angular system could make that easier for you. Another thing that is definitely useful in Angular system is the ability to create singletons. So all of their services are singletons. So they'll only create one, and they'll pass that service to everywhere that uses it as a dependency. So if you wanted something to share data throughout your whole application, that would make it easier to do that because you only have one instance of that thing. But,
yeah, I mean, I guess a module can easily just export the one instance of itself, and then you just import that module.
Yeah.
Same thing with a module loader can do. So I don't know. I think I do like having modules be your globals, if you will, which these dependency injections are kind of necessarily globals. Can you have contextual modules in Angular? So there could be 2 app modules on like different.
Yeah. So like this Angular module can either be for the whole page, or it can be scoped to a certain div or whatever.
Okay.
You can do that.
That's cool. Oh.
Cool. So that's enough about Angular. So kind of to recap, dependency injection can make testing easier. StealClone makes dependency injection easy for tests. You can use it without rewriting your tests or rewriting your modules. You can use it just in the places that you want, and it's available now.
Awesome. One final question. So StealClone, what's the performance characteristic of that? It's just copying the module loader, and then once you inject something, is it just having to re-execute the kind of parents of the module that you're injecting?
Yeah, so it's copying the module loader, and then for any of the modules that you're overriding, it is looking up their parents and try to find someone. Looking up their parents and basically removing them, so that if they're already loaded, they'll be loaded again with the new overridden module when you load it.
When they're like if you go back to the example, what this is going to do, what clone is going to do is it's going to say, hey, here's the definition of models user, but it's going to invalidate or just delete maybe. Delete? Is the text of the module still kept? Or like the parents? So if like navigation depends on model/user, when navigation is imported, is the code having to be reloaded, or does it just re-execute the code?
Did you add a fetch hook, Kevin? Probably.
Yeah.
Oh, you did add a fetch hook?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So maybe it's not being reloaded?
Yeah, I think that it's not being reloaded, but I do not know for sure.
I hope so. That'd be we should make that work if it's not already, because then to recap this for everybody in case people are left behind. So there's a module registry when this file runs, right? So like in this actual test file, there's the Steel loader, and that has a system loader inside of it, and that has all of the modules that have been loaded up to this point. Presumably, maybe navigation has already been loaded, and maybe models user has already been loaded.
Yes, he is reusing the source.
Awesome. Perfect. So what clone is going to do is say, hey, create a new loader object, right, which has its own registry of all the modules. But what we're going to do is copy all the old ones in, so we don't have to like re-execute them, except we're going to say, hey, here's the new definition for models user. And then anything that depended on models user, we're going to say, hey, you need to be re-executed, right? So what happens when navigation, which is one of those modules that depends on models user, is imported again, then the module loader is going to say, okay, well, now we need the code. But because maybe we've already loaded the code in the old registry, it's not going to actually have to go to the server and download that code. Instead, it's just going to rerun its JavaScript with models user as the module. So performance-wise, then, it should be all very fast. The dependency injection should run really quick, which is obviously a really good thing if you want your tests to run quickly. So that's good. That's really awesome.
I just have to say, like, I've always been a little bit of a dependency and injection skeptic, I would say. I haven't really, I don't know, I just haven't, I guess I haven't put the time into. I always thought it was like, you know, like you explained with the Angular example, there's like a lot you have to write to me is like kind of a smaller gain. I've always thought, you know, well, you just use regular argument passing, that whole. But I really like the way that you explained it as far as, you know, not having to test the whole dependency chain when you do a test. Is you can, I think this can make it much easier. Sometimes I struggle with, you know, well, I have to set up an entire world just to run a test. And if I could just replace this one specific module, I could write a lot more. Like, it makes it easier to write a lot of tests, whether, you know, if you're taking 15 minutes to write one test because you have to do so much, we can write a lot of small tests using this method. So you won me over.
Good. Good. Yeah. It's always felt weird to me to have to mock out a server's response when I'm trying to test, like, something tiny that's showing up on the UI that doesn't touch the server at all. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. It was. I mean, the reason why Can Fixture was our fallback is because it's like the one place, in some ways, you can inject a dependency. If you think about it, that's really dependency injection. All it is there a central place where you can inject something, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to inject a fake AJAX response. Now we've gone much better and said we can inject a fake model or a fake module at any point. So that's awesome.
Yeah, the other thing is a lot of people will try to use like sign-on.js to mock out certain functions that are a part of a module, and that works sometimes, but a lot of the time it doesn't, or it's even more complicated than just mocking out the AJAX response. So yeah, I agree. I think this is going to help a lot. I mean, I know that it is because it's already helping me write tests. So.
And zones maybe can even help with that someday, if you think about it, because it can inject any globals for code that would run, presumably.
It's true. Yeah.
So if you were doing like an alert or something like that, you could inject
alert.
Easily, huh?
Yeah, great. The fake alert.
Actually require the user to hit the alert OK button.
Yeah, I was wondering. This is kind of way off track, but I was kind of wondering if zones could help with the async tests. So like in my example, if you forget to call done inside of some async behavior, can we get rid of that entirely and just have the zone count how many async things have happened and call done for us?
It could.
Probably.
It could.
So I think that would be awesome, because how many times have people forgot to call done and your test isn't actually doing anything? So
that'd be awesome. Cool. It's a brave new world.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Phillipses.
Thank you.
Sure.
Kevin, great job. I'm really excited to use this.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. See you all next week.